Our story begins on a hot summer day in New York City. Spider-Man is out on patrol when he sees police cars racing to a hostage situation at a clothing store. A SWAT team is with them, and Peter figures that they have things under control, until lightning bursts from the store window. Suddenly, this looks like a job for Spider-Man. Inside the store, Electro stops trying on clothes and changes back into his costume. He charges out onto the street with his goons, and they make short work of the remaining police officers. When one of the minions is about to finish off one of the cops, Peter disarms him and ties the attacker to a lamppost. In no short amount of time, the rest of the goons are taken out, and Electro strikes at Spider-Man. Peter easily dodges the rest of the villain's attacks and begins to fling parts of a SWAT van at the criminal. In response, Electro knocks a nearby wall down. A woman and her child are nearly crushed, but Peter uses his incredible strength to save their lives. Electro blasts the wall, causing it to crumble around his foe, but Peter is still standing. He grabs a manhole cover and flings it at the villain. Electro easily dodges it. However, Peter reveals that he intended for that to happen. The cover slices through a fire hydrant, and it short-circuits Electro, knocking him out cold. As Peter recovers, the police close in on Spider-Man and demand his surrender. Parker flees, and one of the officers stops the rest of the NYPD from firing on the man that just saved their lives. As Peter leaves the scene, he grabs his camera and takes a few more pictures of the aftermath. Parker needs to sell as much as he can to the Daily Bugle these days. After all, money's important when a guy is just a couple days from getting married. Moments later, across town, another robbery is being conducted. They make it to the getaway car when suddenly it flips over. Peter is happy to give the crooks over to the cops, who he asks if there are any other emergencies going on in the city. They direct Spider-Man to a fire elsewhere, and he sets off to help out. After doing so, and getting a few more pictures along the way, Peter returns home. Thanks to his spider sense, he knows nobody is watching and slips into his apartment. Peter settles in until Mary Jane comes home to drop off some of her things. They greet each other, and MJ comments that Spider-Man has been all over the news today. She looks over the pictures that Peter took and asks how his camera knows when to take a picture of him while he's crime fighting. Peter explains that sometimes when he's moving fast, the camera does miss him, but usually a microtransmitter in his belt signals the camera when to take a picture. Parker then asks if they're going to have enough room in the apartment for all of MJ's clothes, so she suggests that they throw some things out. She says that they should start off with a replica made of Peter's original costume, but Parker is not eager to do this, and figures they can sort this out after she's moved in. Mary Jane leaves just as quickly as she arrived, as a limo is waiting for her. The woman's boss says that she is his favorite model, and is needed for a photo shoot. As Peter watches her embark for work, he wonders if he can provide for somebody like MJ, who is used to a life of glitz and glamour, while Parker has been scraping by as Spider-Man for years. Mary Jane seems to be more understanding to Peter being a superhero, as she only recently found out about this, but Parker is worried as he remembers that not too long ago, his fiancée had a profound hatred of Spider-Man. At the Daily Bugle, Peter successfully sells some of his pictures, but managing editor Joe Robertson stops Parker from leaving. The man wants to show Peter something and leads him to the lunchroom. Peter is surprised to find that the Bugle staff have prepared a party in his honor to congratulate him on the upcoming wedding. Parker is blown away by this kindness until J. Jonah Jameson enters the room. Robertson tries to talk Jameson down, knowing that the cantankerous employer doesn't like parties on company time. But the publisher insists that he's no ogre. Jameson tells Peter how proud he is of his employee, and warns Parker that the commitment ahead is a big one. There's no turning back from this. Everyone, including Peter, is shocked at this, and Robertson even manages to convince a reluctant Jameson to sign a bonus check to help with the upcoming wedding. Peter is touched but knows that this was not his boss's idea, so he offers to return the check. Jameson says it is alright, while privately thinking to himself that he'll find some other way to make up for this expense. Parker thinks to himself that for all of Jameson's nonsense, he really is a wise man. This is a big step, and Parker wonders if he really is ready to get married. At the end of the party, Peter departs, grateful for all the well wishes of his peers. Jameson then has one of his staff take down the name of everyone else at the party, so he can dock their pay. Peter then uses the money to buy Mary Jane a proper engagement ring, and in his own unique way, he proposes to her. They have dinner together and ask each other if they are having second thoughts on all of this. Both deny it, but clearly Peter and Mary Jane aren't sure about the wedding. An awkward moment of silence is interrupted when the phone rings. MJ gets a call from a man named Bruce, who is an important figure in Hollywood. He tries to get Mary Jane to come to his villa in the south of France to talk her out of getting married, but MJ playfully brushes him off. Mary Jane then has to leave. She has to cancel an important appointment this Sunday with a high-profile fashion designer named Willie Smith. After all, she can't miss their wedding day. The designer understands this and is happy that the young woman has found somebody she loves. He even tells her to expect a little surprise in the mail over the next few days. After all, tradition states that the bride needs to wear something new. When MJ leaves, she bumps into a mysterious figure, who gives her a cassette tape and directs her to a nearby Ferrari where she can listen to it. MJ is confused but curious, so she complies. The tape turns out to be a recording of Bruce, who says that she can keep the car, as he has too, and he has left tickets to Paris in the glove compartment. He wants her to leave Peter and go with him to France, and while Mary Jane is amused by all of this, she is also tempted by the offer. Later, on a quiet suburban street in Queens, Peter comes to the house he grew up in. He greets his Aunt May warmly, and she welcomes him home. Peter goes through some old family photos while May goes to check on a pie. He reflects on how he became Spider-Man and what happened to the first woman he ever loved. Soon, MJ and her Aunt Anna come by, and the young couple seek the two older women down in the kitchen. They share the happy news that they are getting married, and both women are overjoyed. May notices that Peter looks nervous, but his aunt is certain that he still is a Parker and has enough good sense to do what is right. The two embrace and affirm their love for one another. Later, MJ and Peter leave, and when Parker offers to share a subway ride back to the city, Mary Jane says she has to go and meet a friend. Peter sees his fiancée being picked up by none other than Bruce, and while Peter tries to talk himself out of being worried, he begins to get jealous as the hours wane on. At 1 a.m., Peter is shocked to find Mary Jane at the door. She says she got a ride to the city from Bruce and has been wandering around Manhattan for a few hours now, trying to think. She asks where Peter goes when he needs to think, and Parker says he goes somewhere quiet and private where he can't be bothered. MJ asks to be taken there, and Peter complies. But the girl is shocked to learn that this place is actually at the very top of the Empire State Building. She's scared, but Peter reminds her that he will never let anything happen to her, and even up here, he will never let her get harmed. Mary Jane asks what he thinks about up here, and Peter says he thinks on life and takes in the sights. Places like Times Square, the Pan Am Building, and the Brooklyn Bridge. MJ remembers the bridge is where Gwen died, but realizes that talking about this is upsetting to Parker. Peter says it's okay, but he clearly is still bothered by that tragic moment. Spider-Man takes Mary Jane home, and the girl thinks to herself that swinging through New York City is a far greater thrill than any limo ride, but it will still take some getting used to. The two share a goodnight kiss, though Peter is still bothered by thoughts of Gwen Stacy. Morning comes, and he gets a call from an ecstatic Mary Jane. Willie Smith designed an original wedding gown just for her, and she is eager for Peter to see it on their wedding day. At noon, the couple go to the courthouse and register for their wedding license. The clerk notes that this is their first time getting married, and Mary Jane assures the man that it will be their last. Peter notes to himself that he never really thought of things that way, that they're getting married forever. After finishing the paperwork, Peter leaves to run some errands, and the two agree to meet for dinner later. Parker goes to the Mercy General Hospital, where Flash Thompson is recovering from an earlier attack by the Hobgoblin. Peter asks if Flash will be his best man, and his friend eagerly accepts the offer. He is truly honored by this and declares that they're going to need to do a bachelor party tomorrow night. Parker is nervous about this, but it only makes Flash all the more certain of a need for a party. Peter agrees and goes to meet up with MJ at a restaurant. Peter Parker has faced many threats before, but none as terrifying as this. Overwhelmed by the wedding and afraid that his fiancée is going to get hurt, he's about to call it off when MJ interrupts him and shows her groom-to-be a picture of the gown she got. Looking at it, Peter says it is beautiful, and MJ says she is going to make Peter so proud on their wedding, almost as proud as she is of him. He decides not to call off the wedding and instead mentions that Flash is holding a bachelor party tomorrow night. MJ says she will be going to a similar party hosted by her friends, and the two finish their dinner uneventfully. The next night, Peter goes to the party, which is a very low-key affair with just him, Flash, and Harry Osborn. His two friends are excited for the wedding, but Peter admits he's been having doubts lately. He's worried that MJ might get hurt and that marriage might not be right for him. Harry insists that he and Liz Allen are happy together and marriage was the best thing to ever happen to them. Peter is still unsure. So Flash relates his own romantic past and tells Peter that he needs to go for this opportunity while he still has it. Thompson asks if Peter loves this girl, to which he says yes. So Flash says this is all that really matters, and the three friends share a toast together. Elsewhere, MJ is attending her own party. This one is on a far grander scale, with many guests, gifts, and plenty of men who are begging the girl to reconsider her marriage. One man asks why she would give up all of this glamour for a regular domestic life, and MJ admits she sometimes asks herself this very same question. She gets a telegram from Bruce, still offering to fly her to France. MJ wonders if he'll ever stop, and whether or not she'd like him to. She brushes these concerns off and begins to party once more. Later that night, Peter dreams of tomorrow's events. He finds himself at the wedding, with heroes and villains gathered to witness, and Dr. Octopus playing the organ. Spider-Man has his picture taken with Uncle Ben and Aunt May, and both of them say how proud they are of Peter. When it is time to present the ring, the Flash can't find it, only for Gwen Stacy to appear. She gives Peter the ring and says she just had to say goodbye. Forever. She disappears and Peter cries out for her. MJ asks if Spider-Man still wants to get married, and he says he does, but suddenly, the villains attack. They tie the other heroes up and begin to close in on Peter. He tells MJ to run, but they overpower him and charge at his bride. Peter wakes up screaming, so he goes to the Brooklyn Bridge. Thinking of Gwen, he feels bad. Once, he swore that Stacy would be the only woman he'd ever love, and now, he's about to marry somebody else. He loves Mary Jane, but he loved Gwen once too, and she died because of Peter's love. Parker sits in the darkness, not knowing what to do, what is right, or what is fair. He pleads for his lost love to help him, but his call goes unanswered. Elsewhere, MJ is picked up by Bruce. He continues to hit on her in spite of how she feels, but she admits she doesn't want to be alone right now. Right here, at this moment, she needs to make a decision. Sunday morning arrives, and everyone is ready for the wedding, but soon the crowd becomes concerned as both Mary Jane and Peter are nowhere to be found. Suddenly, MJ speeds toward the church in her Ferrari, apologizing but declaring she wanted to be perfect for Peter. She is heartbroken to hear that Peter is also missing, until Parker arrives, late as well, but eager to get married. The ceremony begins and the two declare their vows for one another. MJ says she will take this very special man to be the most important thing in her life, because that's exactly what he already is. Peter says that she knows better than anyone what she's getting into, and still wants to be with him. How could he possibly turn something like that down? With that, Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson Parker are declared husband and wife. The reception goes well thanks to the generous sponsorship of the Daily Bugle, which Jameson was all too happy to do as this event is fully deductible under new tax laws. Peter is sad though, as he wishes he could afford a honeymoon for them to go on. So Mary Jane then shows him that she just happened to get a pair of first-class tickets to Paris and keys to a villa in France. Bruce gave them to her as a wedding present, as it seems he won't be needing them after all. 2 weeks later, the couple return from their honeymoon. Peter wonders how they're supposed to adjust after 2 weeks in a fabulous French villa only to move back to a dump like this apartment. But MJ assures him that they're doing what they do anywhere, living happily ever after. Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and this is the complete story of The Wedding. Well, this video should be fairly self-evident. Between the One More Day review, which is coming soon, I promise, and Renew Your Vows, I've been thinking a lot about Peter Parker and Mary Jane these days. It felt natural to go over the original tale of them getting married as a companion video to all of this, especially considering I've never really bothered to actually sit down and read this one before. I didn't really know what to expect. I mean, a wedding isn't anything new, and it's often used as a source of false drama and unrealistic stakes in comics, movies, television, and even books. A wedding is often used as a plot device to force a story and drama that is supposed to be a big deal when it's usually just boring. All too often, this winds up with a story akin to watching paint dry. But after reading it, I wound up liking this comic for 3 big reasons. First, it reeks of effort. Solid, awesome effort. A lot of work is clearly done in the storytelling, which details a lot of the events in the few days before the wedding. But what really shines here is the art, featuring a lot of great little details, and a wedding dress designed by actual fashion designer Willie Smith. It's a pretty sad story actually, as Smith's designs for this comic were one of his last projects. The man died of AIDS shortly after completing the designs and never actually got to see the final product in the comic itself. It's tragic, but Marvel did honor him by having the designer of the dress in the comic's story share the same name as the actual fashion designer. I don't know anything about fashion, but the dress looks pretty good to me. It's unique and well, it's not really our place to judge the clothing and fashion of 1987. You have to take these things with a grain of salt, as fashion will always look a little out of date over time. The point is that it's clear that the writer and editor-in-chief Jim Shooter really believed in this comic. He put a lot of work into it, wanting to make sure it all looked and felt authentic, and you can tell because this comic is pretty well thought out overall. That brings me to the second great thing about this comic. Oh sure, I'm starting to pick up on certain patterns in writing from this era, as The Wedding suffers from many of the same problems that I noticed in Secret Wars. The dialogue is clunky and at times feels really stilted and awkward, and the story jumps from one scene to the next so quickly that it becomes a bit of a drag about halfway through the comic. Peter also at times comes across as really stupid and impulsive in this story, as apparently he only realized that wedding is a permanent commitment when he was at the courthouse getting a wedding license. But looking past that at the bigger picture, I see a lot of clever writing decisions that really outweigh these flaws. See, this whole idea of Spider-Man getting married was a bit controversial at the time of this comic being published. Now, by virtue of not having been born when this thing came out, I can really only go by secondhand information. But from what I understand, a lot of fans were worried about this change in Peter's life. And there was some merit to this concern. Mary Jane was originally a character created to be the girl next door, a bit of a rival to Gwen Stacy, and not much more. The romance between Peter and MJ felt a little bit rushed and pushed forward at this time, and you get a good sense of that even in this comic. It feels like 2 young people that have somewhat impulsively decided to get married. You can see this in the story. They only get everything together and tell all their friends and family in that few days before the wedding. Certainly, it's an interesting aspect of this story. The whole tale is mired in this couple's doubts about their marriage. As a result, Peter and MJ come to represent the fans' own concern, and we get to see how each of them deal with these worries. And what's really cool is we don't actually get to see them figure this out in the panels. That's largely left to the reader to see how they go from being unsure to ultimately ready for the wedding. We get to use our brains and draw our own conclusions, and to connect the dots from these few subtle scenes and moments to understand why these 2 want to commit to one another. And why, At the end of the day, in spite of the differences between these two, they might actually be right for each other. I'm still not sure if this was for the best, or if MJ, a glamorous supermodel with a life of success in high society, is really right for Peter, a grounded character who prefers a quiet life to cover his superhero lifestyle. I like this comic is willing to let us decide if this is all for the best or not. Personally, I think it is. MJ appreciates what Peter does and also likes the thrill of him being Spider-Man, while Peter gets someone to help him remember what is important and a person who he can share his secret identity and his life with. But I can also see the apparent disconnect between these two, perhaps best illustrated in the two parties that are held before the wedding. One is all glamorous and nice, while the other is a lot more grounded and low-key. But there's other aspects of this comic's writing I really like. Aside from the opening scenes, this comic is focused entirely on the interpersonal relationships of the various people in Peter's life. A lot of characters really shine in this story, and not just the happy couple. Flash Thompson has a great moment where I feel he has a really important part in convincing Peter to go through with his wedding. It's funny that the guy I all too often think of as just Peter's high school bully went on to become so close to this man. And J. Jonah Jameson also has a great part in this story, where he shows some tender moments without the comic invalidating his hardline established personality. So I was really impressed with this writing on the whole. For a story that's pretty simple, there's a surprising amount of depth in the writing, and I really appreciate it. The wedding has hardly any action at all and is a lot of character-driven dialogue, but the few bits of action at the beginning were fantastic. I feel like it's literally been years since I've seen Peter Parker just roam around New York helping people. You know, his job. This scene and several other little moments throughout the comic also highlight a few aspects of Peter's powers and abilities, which I also enjoyed quite a bit. I even learned a little bit about how Spider-Man is able to take pictures of himself. It's always kind of neat to learn things like this, and it's also cool to see Spider-Man's black suit in action. Though you can tell they haven't really come up with the idea of Venom yet, as he's not affected by the suit and it's barely even part of the story. That's fine. You know that writers generally are making this stuff up as they go along, but it should be noted that this comic is far from perfect. The third thing I really like about The Wedding is that it makes me miss Spider-Man comics. Oh sure, there are plenty of Spider-Man comics being made right now, many of which I do like. What I mean when this story makes me miss old Spider-Man comics is not that they were better written or had less plot holes, but rather older Spider-Man stories were a lot better at moving the plot forward. For example, let's compare Spider-Verse to The Wedding for a second, shall we? Now I agree it's not entirely fair to compare these two, but it illustrates my point quite nicely. I liked Spider-Verse. It was far from perfect, but even I can't resist fan service of that insane caliber. However, in Spider-Verse, Peter Parker starts out as a confident leader of the Spider Army who has killed more than twice already, and comes out of it a confident leader of the Spider Army, now certain he's the best Spider-Man there is. In other words, he doesn't change. Nothing happens to his character, nothing in the ongoing story arc is any different, none of it really matters, and you could skip the entire event and not miss a single important point in Peter's story. The Wedding, on the other hand, starts with an uncertain, tepid Peter Parker and lets you draw the line between that and the Peter Parker at the end of the story who is happy, confident, and eager to start a new chapter in his life. That is change, and Peter Parker would never be the same after this story. This comic does a great job at showing how Spider-Man's life would be different from here on out, and it led to some pretty interesting Spider-Man stories on the whole. I've said it before, but I really like the time these two spent together married. So do you see how different these two stories are? One has consequences and is grounded in both reality and depth. The other is fan service grounded in selling more comics and having lots of Spider-Man running around fighting vampires. Now there are plenty of room for both types of these stories, but these days it feels like Spider-Man is all spectacle and no substance. I feel like these new Spider-Man stories have lowered my standards, and it took something more polished like The Wedding to remind me of that. It's not like I think The Wedding is the best Spider-Man story I've ever read. Honestly, I don't think it even comes close to some of the best Mary Jane stories I've ever read. But it does remind me that Spider-Man comics can and should be better. They can be lighthearted fun. A lot of this comic is pretty light. But sometimes a little bit of time spent on characters, change, and consequences can go a very long way. With a character like Peter Parker, but really with any protagonist, this is very important because you need to emotionally connect with the main character. it's hard to feel for a general of a Spider-Man army, or a CEO who turns his back on medical research to focus on making a superhero prison because that better fits Peter's ego. In comparison, it's a lot easier to connect to a guy who needs to make money to provide for himself and the people he cares about. I feel a lot more for somebody who's nervous about going through a big change in his life than someone who never experiences any personal change or consequences anymore. So what's the point of all this? Well, it's probably for one thing that a lot of the newer Spider-Man comics are so bad in comparison to stories like The Wedding that it makes these older tales seem like Shakespeare. The Wedding is flawed and has problems all over the place, and I have a feeling I like this comic just because it's so much better compared to what I'm used to these days. But ignoring all of that, this is a comic published 28 years ago that somehow feels refreshing. One way or another, this is either a solid recommendation or a scathing indictment. I'll leave it to you guys to decide what of these two it is. It's probably a little bit of both if we're being honest. So thanks for watching. I hope you liked this story and my review. Let me know what you think in the comments section below. And as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.